Bismarck Sea, March 3, 1943, 0600 hours. Rear Admiral Masato Kimura, commanding the L resupply convoy, stands on the bridge of his flagship watching 8 destroyers shepherd 8 fully loaded transport ships through waters Japanese naval doctrine says belong to the Empire. The convoy carries the 51st Division's desperately needed reinforcements. 6,900 soldiers promised to Lieutenant General Hitazo Adachi at La, and Kimura has every reason to believe they will arrive safely. Japanese warships have sailed these waters for more than a year without serious challenge from American surface forces. What Admiral Kimura cannot possibly know, what no Japanese naval officer could imagine in their darkest nightmares, is that American mechanics in Australian workshops have transformed medium bombers into something that will make these waters a killing field. Within 4 hours, modified B-25 Mitchell bombers, with 50 caliber machine guns protruding from their noses like the fangs of some mechanical demon, will turn his convoy into burning wreckage scattered across the Bismarck Sea. The Japanese Navy's confidence comes from experience, victories at Pearl Harbor, and the Java Sea, and from the seeming inability of high-altitude American bombers to hit moving ships. They also believe their destroyers' anti-aircraft guns can handle any low-flying aircraft foolish enough to approach within range. Captain Tamichihara, commanding the destroyer Shigar, has sailed these waters between Ribal and Lam multiple times. He knows the Americans have tried everything to stop Japanese convoys. High-level bombing from B-7 flying fortresses that rarely hit anything. Torpedo attacks that require long, straight approaches and make the attackers perfect targets. And medium-altitude bombing that gives ships plenty of time to maneuver away from falling bombs. The Imperial Japanese Navy has developed specific tactics for dealing with aerial threats, including rapid evasive maneuvers, concentrated anti-aircraft fire from multiple ships, and fighter cover from the 11th Air Fleet based at Ribal. These tactics have worked well enough that Admiral Genichi Mikawa approved this convoy, despite knowing the Americans would detect it. Japanese naval officers understand aerial warfare differently than their American counterparts, viewing it primarily as a battle between ships and horizontal bombers or torpedo planes. Encounters where disciplined anti-aircraft fire and sharp maneuvering can defeat most attacks. Commander Yasumi Doi aboard the destroyer Takatik has drilled his gun crews relentlessly, teaching them to concentrate their 25mm cannons on approaching aircraft, lead their targets properly, and maintain steady fire even when under attack. The convoy's anti-aircraft defenses include more than 125mm guns, dozens of 13mm machine guns, and the destroyer's 5-inch dual-purpose guns, creating what Japanese doctrine calls an umbrella of steel over the ships. These defenses have proven effective against conventional attacks, shooting down or driving off American bombers on numerous occasions, and giving the Japanese confidence they can handle whatever the Allies throw at them. The transport ships carry vital cargo beyond the soldiers: ammunition, medical supplies, food, and equipment that Japanese forces at La desperately need to maintain their position in New Guinea. The largest transport, Kimbaru, displaces over 6,000 tons and carries an entire regiment of the 51st Division, men who have been waiting at Rabaul for weeks for weather conditions that would allow the convoy to sail. Each transport has been carefully loaded to maximize troop numbers while still carrying essential supplies, and the soldiers have been briefed that they are sailing into a combat zone where American aircraft are active, but where Japanese naval superiority should protect them. During the relatively short voyage to La, the convoy maintains a precise formation with destroyers, screening the transports, ready to respond to submarine attacks or aerial threats, following procedures refined through 2 years of war in the Pacific. What makes March 3, 1943 different from every previous convoy operation is not immediately apparent to the Japanese lookouts who spot the first American aircraft approaching from the south. Lieutenant Commander Aikata aboard the destroyer. Asashia reports multiple contacts at medium altitude, what appears to be a standard American bombing formation, of B-7s and B-25s, approaching at around 7,000 feet. Exactly the kind of attack the convoy has prepared for. The Japanese gun crews swing their weapons toward the approaching aircraft, calculating deflection and altitude, preparing to throw up the curtain of anti-aircraft fire that has protected so many convoys before. But they do not yet see the other aircraft approaching at wave-top height. B-25 Mitchells modified, in ways the Japanese cannot imagine. The modification of B-25s into Strafer gunships represents one of the most significant tactical innovations of the Pacific. War, born from frustration with the ineffectiveness of conventional bombing against ships. Major Paul Irvin Gunn, known as Pappy, a former Navy pilot turned Army Air Forces officer, understood that hitting moving ships from high altitude was nearly impossible, and that torpedo attacks required specialized training and equipment the AAF did not have in the Southwest Pacific. Working with North American Aviation Field Representative Jack Fox at Eagle Farm Airfield near Brisbane, Australia, Gunn began installing additional 50 caliber machine guns in the noses of B-25 bombers, removing the bombardier position and creating space for 4 guns initially, then expanding to 8 in later modifications. The work required extensive reinforcement of the aircraft's nose structure, additional ammunition storage, and careful weight distribution to keep the aircraft balanced. Challenges Gunn and his mechanics solved through trial and error. The 50 caliber machine guns chosen for these modifications fired the M8 armor-piercing incendiary round, a 6.19 grain projectile that traveled at 2,010 feet per second, capable of penetrating the deck armor of destroyers and setting fires with its incendiary component. Each gun could fire 850 rounds per minute, meaning 8 guns firing together could unleash 6,800 rounds per minute, a stream of destruction that could literally saw through a ship's superstructure, destroy anti-aircraft positions, and kill exposed crew members before they could react. The psychological effect of facing this weapon proved as devastating as its physical destruction. Survivors would later describe the terror of seeing a B-25's nose light up with muzzle flashes, knowing that hundreds of armor-piercing rounds were about to tear through their ship. The development of skip bombing tactics complemented the Strafer modifications perfectly, allowing B-25s to attack ships at mast height while delivering bombs with deadly accuracy. Major William Benn of the 43rd Bombardment Group had pioneered the technique using B-7s, discovering that bombs dropped from 200 to 250 feet above the water would skip like stones, bouncing into the sides of ships or exploding close enough to cause fatal damage. The technique required precise timing and incredible courage as pilots had to fly straight and level toward their targets at low altitude, making themselves perfect targets for anti-aircraft fire. But the accuracy achieved was revolutionary compared to high-altitude bombing. Pilots practiced endlessly against the wreck of SS Pruth on a reef near Port Moresby, learning to judge distances, speeds, and release points until they could consistently skip bombs into targets. General George Kenney, commanding the 5th Air Force, had overseen the development and adoption of these tactics and the modified aircraft that would soon turn the Bismarck Sea into a slaughter ground. General Kenney recognized the potential of combining Strafer modifications with skip bombing tactics, creating what he called commerce destroyers that could devastate Japanese shipping. By March 1943, the 3rd Attack Group had fully converted to the Strafer configuration, with the 90th Bombardment Squadron commanded by Major Edward Linder leading the way in developing attack tactics that maximized the effectiveness of the 8-gun nose. The standard attack profile called for B-25s to approach at 1,000 to 2,500 feet, then drop to wave-top height about 2 miles from the target, accelerating to maximum speed while the pilot aligned the aircraft with the ship. At 1,500 yards, the pilot would open fire with all 8 nose guns, hosing the target with armor-piercing incendiary rounds while maintaining the approach for skip bombing. Admiral Kimura's first hint that something unprecedented was about to happen came when the B-17s at 7,000 feet began their bombing runs, drawing the attention of every Japanese anti-aircraft gun in the convoy. The destroyer crews performed exactly as trained, putting up an impressive barrage of 25mm and 5-inch fire, their tracers creating a deadly pattern in the sky around the American bombers. This was precisely what the American planners intended. While every Japanese eye watched the high-altitude bombers and every gun barrel pointed skyward, 13 Royal Australian Air Force Boomerang fighters and 12 B-25 Mitchell Strafers of the 3rd Attack Group came in at wave-top height from the southwest, approaching so low that their propeller wash sprayed the ocean surface. Major Edward Linder led the B-25 attack in his Mitchell nicknamed Ruthless. As he closed on the destroyer Shiryuki at 280 mm, he could see Japanese sailors on deck pointing in shock and confusion. The Japanese had seen B-25s before, but never configured like this. Never with 8 black apertures in the nose where machine guns protruded like accusatory fingers. Never approaching at an altitude where pilots could see individual faces on the ship's deck. Linder waited until he was 200 yards from Shiryuki before squeezing the trigger, and instantly 8 streams of 50 caliber death reached toward the destroyer. The tracers formed solid lines of light between aircraft and ship. The effect on Shiryuki was instantaneous and catastrophic, as hundreds of armor-piercing incendiary rounds slammed into her bridge and superstructure at 2,910 feet per second. Bridge windows exploded in showers of glass that shredded anyone standing nearby. The thin armor of the gun shields provided no protection against 50 caliber rounds that punched through steel like paper. And within seconds, the destroyer's anti-aircraft guns fell silent, as their crews were literally torn apart by the concentrated fire. A Japanese ensign named Takashi Mieta, one of the few survivors from Shiryuki's bridge, would later describe the attack as being caught in a giant metal cutting saw, watching his captain and most of the bridge crew cut down in seconds by rounds that sparked and flashed as they tore through steel bulkheads. Linder maintained his firing run for 8 seconds, pouring over 900 rounds into Shiryuki before releasing 2 500-pound bombs that skipped across the water like stones and slammed into the destroyer's hull just below the waterline. The bombs, fitted with 5-second delay fuses, penetrated Shiryuki's hull before detonating. The explosions broke the destroyer's back and opened massive holes that flooded her engine rooms within minutes. As Linder pulled up and away, his gunner sprayed the destroyer's deck with turret-mounted 50s. Shiryuki was already listing heavily to port, her crew abandoning their guns to fight flooding that could not be controlled. Behind Linder, 11 more B-25 selected targets among the convoy, their pilots amazed at how the Japanese ship seemed paralyzed by this unprecedented form of attack. Lieutenant John Hennebrey in the lead targeted the transport Kawakushi Maru, walking his 8-gun burst from bow to stern and watching his tracers punch through the ship's bridge, demolish forward cargo handling equipment, and silence anti-aircraft positions before his skip bombs tore into the hull. The transport's captain, trying to maneuver away, found his helm unresponsive because the helmsman and most of the bridge crew had been cut down by 50 caliber rounds that turned the bridge into a charnel house of shattered bodies and twisted metal. The boomerang fighters added to the carnage, their 4 20mm cannons and 6 303 machine guns focusing on anti-aircraft positions and bridge crews, suppressing any attempt at organized defense. Flight Sergeant Fred Cassidy, flying a boomerang of No. 30 Squadron, made his approach toward the transport Tiyomaru at 500 feet, diving to mast height in the final seconds while his cannons ripped into the ship's superstructure. Cassidy would later describe the bridge disintegrating under the impact of 20mm explosive rounds, seeing sailors thrown into the air by explosions, and watching lifeboats shatter as his rounds found them. Skip bombing proved devastatingly effective as bomb after bomb bounced across the water and slammed into Japanese hulls at the waterline. The delayed action fuses ensured the bombs penetrated before exploding. The transport Nojima took 3 skip bomb hits in rapid succession. The explosions opened her hull like a can opener, flooding holds where hundreds of soldiers were packed into spaces meant for cargo. Soldiers wearing full combat gear had no chance of escaping the rapidly flooding compartments, and witnesses later described hearing their screams even over the roar of aircraft engines and exploding ammunition. Commander Yasumi Doi aboard Tokatake watched in horror as his carefully trained gun crews were swept away by streams of 50 caliber fire, their bodies literally torn apart by the large rounds. He tried to organize a defense, shouting orders to redirect fire toward the low-flying attackers, but his gunners were being killed faster than they could respond, and those who survived were too terrified to stand at their posts as B-25s approached with noses flickering with muzzle flashes. The Japanese Navy had never trained for this, never imagined medium bombers could be turned into flying battleships bristling with forward-firing guns, and never developed tactics to counter an attack that combined strafing and bombing at wavetop height. The destroyer Arashio attempted to maneuver between the attacking aircraft and the transports, its captain trying to shield the vulnerable cargo ships with his warship. The gesture only made Arashio a priority target. 3 B-25s concentrated on Arashio, their combined 24 guns pouring over 2,000 rounds per minute into the destroyer, turning her superstructure into twisted metal, killing everyone on her bridge, destroying her fire control systems, and leaving her rudder jammed hard to starboard. Out of control, Arashio collided with the transport Nojima. Both ships locked together as fires spread between them, and crews proved unable to separate the vessels or fight the flames effectively. Admiral Kimura, watching from his flagship as his convoy disintegrated, struggled to comprehend what was happening. The attack was unlike anything in Japanese naval experience or doctrine. The Americans were not following any recognized attack pattern, not making torpedo runs that could be anticipated, not dropping bombs from altitude that could be dodged. Instead, they were coming in at point-blank range with automatic weapons that turned ships into slaughterhouses. He ordered evasive maneuvers, but the B-25s were too fast and too numerous, seeming to come from every direction at once. Their 8-gun noses spat death at any ship that tried to maintain formation. The transport Oyamaru became a particular focus when her captain made the fatal mistake of turning to present his broadside to the approaching B-25s, giving them a perfect target. Lieutenant Donald McCullough in Sleepy Time Gal approached from the beam and opened fire at 500 yards, his 8-gun sending a stream of armor-piercing incendiary rounds into Oyamaru's hull at the waterline. The rounds penetrated the ship's side, starting fires in cargo holds where ammunition and fuel were stored. The attack created secondary explosions that blew out entire sections of Oyamaru's hull. McCullough's skip bombs finished what his guns had started, breaking Oyamaru in half. She sank so quickly that most of her 2,500 embarked soldiers had no chance to escape. The assault lasted only about 15 minutes, but in that brief time, the carefully organized convoy became a scattered collection of burning, sinking wrecks. The destroyer Asagumo, trying to rescue survivors from the water, was herself struck by 2 B-25s whose guns swept her decks clear of personnel before skip bombs opened holes in her hull below the waterline. Japanese sailors in the water who thought themselves safe watched in terror as B-25s made strafing runs on lifeboats and swimmers. The American pilots were following orders to prevent any Japanese reinforcements from reaching New Guinea. By 10:15 a.m., as the last B-25 disappeared to the south, Admiral Kimura surveyed the devastation and realized that the Imperial Japanese Navy had just experienced something that would fundamentally change naval warfare in the Pacific. Of his 8 transports, all were sinking or already sunk, burning funeral pyres marking their positions as they slipped beneath the waves and taking with them the supplies and equipment desperately needed at Law. 4 of his 8 destroyers were gone, including Shiryuki, and the surviving destroyers were damaged to varying degrees, their decks littered with dead and wounded, their superstructures riddled with 50 caliber holes. The human cost became painfully clear during rescue operations. The water was filled with bodies and debris and relatively few living soldiers. Of the 6,900 troops who sailed from Rabaul, fewer than 1,200 would eventually reach Law, most rescued by Japanese submarines that arrived after dark. The majority of the 51st Division had been destroyed not in ground combat, where they might have fought back, nor by naval gunfire, where they might have had warning, but by modified bombers that turned their transports into death traps in minutes. Captain Tamichihara, one of the few senior officers to survive, later wrote that the attack was like nothing they had ever experienced or imagined, describing how the B-25s seemed to saw their ships in half with concentrated firepower. The psychological impact on the Imperial Japanese Navy proved even greater than the physical losses. As news of the convoy's destruction spread through the fleet, naval officers who had dismissed American bombing as ineffective were forced to confront the reality that the Americans had developed a weapon against which traditional naval defenses were useless. The 50 caliber guns in each B-25's nose represented more forward-firing, automatic weapons than most destroyers carried. Unlike ship-mounted guns, these weapons could be brought to bear with the speed and flexibility of aircraft. Japanese naval doctrine, based on surface engagements and traditional aerial attacks, had no answer for flying gunships that could destroy a convoy in minutes. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto received the report of the Bismarck Sea disaster with visible shock. He understood immediately that Japan could no longer risk surface vessels in waters within range of American aircraft. The Navy's inability to protect even a heavily escorted convoy meant that reinforcement and resupply of forward positions would become almost impossible, effectively dooming Japanese garrisons throughout the Solomon Islands and New Guinea. Yamamoto ordered an immediate review of convoy procedures and anti-aircraft defenses, but privately admitted to his staff that there might be no effective counter to the American Strafer bombers. The transformation of the B-25 Mitchell from a conventional medium bomber into a Strafer gunship represented American mechanical ingenuity at its finest. Born from the practical needs of warfare rather than pre-war doctrine, Major Paul Irvin Gunn, working with limited resources in primitive conditions, created a weapon that proved more effective against shipping than many purpose-built attack aircraft, demonstrating American adaptability. The 8-gun nose modification would become standard on late-production B-25J models as North American Aviation incorporated field modifications into factory production, eventually creating aircraft that could carry up to 18 forward-firing 50-caliber machine guns. Following the Bismarck Sea victory, B-25 Strafers spread throughout the Southwest Pacific, appearing wherever Japanese shipping tried to operate. The 345th Bombardment Group, known as the Apaches, received B-25 Strafers in August 1943 and immediately began hunting Japanese coastal traffic around New Guinea. Their aircraft, decorated with distinctive shark mouths, became synonymous with death to Japanese sailors. The 38th Bombardment Group converted to Strafers as well and developed new tactics for attacking harbors and anchorages, including night attacks using radar to locate targets in complete darkness. By late 1943, Japanese naval officers reported that daylight movement of anything larger than a fishing boat had become suicidal in waters within B-25 range. The impact on Japanese logistics was catastrophic. The Navy was forced to rely increasingly on submarines and fast destroyers running at night to supply forward garrisons. These methods could deliver only a fraction of what surface convoys could carry, leaving Japanese forces throughout the Pacific suffering shortages of food, ammunition, and medical supplies. The garrison at La, which the March 3 convoy was meant to reinforce, never received adequate supplies and was eventually evacuated in September 1943. Soldiers forced to march through jungle and mountains suffered massive casualties from starvation and disease. Japanese attempts to counter the B-25 Strafers proved largely ineffective. The aircraft's speed and firepower made them difficult targets for fighters. Their low-altitude attacks negated the effectiveness of heavy anti-aircraft guns. The Japanese developed desperate measures, including suicide attacks by fighters attempting to ram B-25s, but these could not stop the steady attrition of Japanese shipping. By mid-1944, the Japanese merchant marine had lost over 60% of its tonnage, much of it to B-25 Strafer and skip bombing attacks that turned cargo ships and transports into burning wrecks in minutes. B-25 Strafers continued their deadly work throughout 1944, expanding targets to include Japanese airfields, where their forward guns proved equally effective at destroying aircraft on the ground. Raids in August 1943 on Wewak demonstrated this versatility when B-25 Strafers destroyed over 170 Japanese aircraft in a series of low-level attacks that left the Japanese Fourth Air Army virtually helpless. Japanese pilots described the horror of watching B-25s approach at treetop level, their nose guns destroying everything in their path and turning carefully dispersed aircraft into burning wreckage before bombs completed the destruction. During battles in 1944, B-25 Strafers repeatedly influenced campaigns by denying the enemy freedom of movement at sea. On June 8, 1944, 10 B-25s of the 17th Reconnaissance Squadron attacked a Japanese destroyer flotilla, their 8-gun noses riddling the destroyer Harusami with armor-piercing incendiary rounds before skip bombs sent her to the bottom. The attack forced the Japanese to abandon the reinforcement effort, leaving the garrison to fight without support. The crews flying these modified B-25s developed their own culture and traditions, painting elaborate nose art and giving names like Dirty Dora, Pluto, and Hell's Angel to reflect their aggressive role. They understood they were flying something unique, an aircraft that combined the range and payload of a bomber with firepower exceeding that of most fighters. They took pride in destroying shipping that conventional bombers could not hit, knowing that every Japanese vessel sunk meant fewer supplies and reinforcements reaching enemy garrisons. Survivors carried psychological scars that affected performance in later operations. Lieutenant Hiroshi Yamamoto, a survivor from Kaukusi Maru, described recurring nightmares about the American planes with 8 eyes of death. Unable to forget the sight of shipmates being torn apart by 50 caliber fire. Commander Toshio Abe, who witnessed the Bismarck Sea massacre from a rescue destroyer, reported that his crew became paralyzed with fear whenever they heard aircraft engines, knowing that B-25 Strafers could appear at any moment. The effectiveness of the B-25 Strafer forced a fundamental change in Japanese strategic planning. Commanders had to assume that any daylight movement would be detected and attacked. Operations that would have been routine in 1942 became impossible by late 1943, forcing the Japanese to adopt increasingly desperate measures to maintain their scattered garrisons. The famous Tokyo Express destroyer runs to Guadalcanal were one adaptation, using speed and darkness to avoid air attack. But even these high-speed runs suffered losses when B-25 Strafers equipped with radar began hunting at night. By early 1944, Japanese naval officers were writing reports describing the B-25 Strafer as the most feared weapon in the Pacific, more devastating than submarines, more accurate than dive bombers, more flexible than torpedo planes. Vice Admiral Shigeru Fukudome, Chief of Staff of the Combined Fleet, admitted in a classified report that the Imperial Navy had no effective defense against mass strafer attacks and recommended that surface vessels avoid operating within 500 meters of American air bases. This essentially conceded vast areas of the Pacific to American control, since B-25s operating from forward bases could cover enormous areas of ocean. The Australian contribution to the B-25 Strafer Force deserves special recognition, as Royal Australian Air Force crews flew alongside Americans throughout the campaign. Number 18 Squadron RAAF operated B-25 Strafers from 1944 onward. Their aircraft were distinguished by RAF roundels, but carried the same devastating 8-gun nose configuration. Australian pilots proved particularly aggressive in attacking Japanese coastal shipping around the Netherlands East Indies, using intimate knowledge of regional waters to find targets American crews might miss. The technical evolution of the B-25 Strafer continued throughout the war, with later modifications including rocket launchers, improved gun sights, and experiments with 75mm cannons for attacking larger vessels. The B-25J-22, the ultimate Strafer variant, carried 8 nose guns plus package guns on the fuselage sides, 2 in the top turret, 2 in waist positions, and 2 in the tail. A total of 18 50 caliber machine guns that could deliver devastating firepower from multiple angles. These late war variants were flying arsenals capable of destroying entire convoys single-handedly. German and Italian military observers, learning about American Strafer tactics through intelligence reports, expressed amazement at the concept of converting medium bombers into gunships. The Luftwaffe attempted similar modifications with Junkers Ju-88 aircraft, installing forward-firing cannons for anti-shipping attacks, but never achieved the concentrated firepower of the B-25's 8-gun nose. Italian forces in the Mediterranean used skip bombing techniques with SM-79 torpedo bombers, but lacked the forward firepower to suppress anti-aircraft defenses the way B-25 Strafers could. The impact of the B-25 Strafer extended beyond immediate tactical success and influenced post-war aircraft design and military doctrine. The concept of a heavily armed gunship proved so successful that it led directly to the development of aircraft like the AC-47 Spooky and AC-130 Spectre used in Vietnam and subsequent conflicts. The integration of massive forward firepower in aircraft designed for other purposes became a standard American military practice, traced directly back to Pappy Gunn's modifications in Australia. Japanese military historians writing after the war acknowledged that the B-25 Strafer represented one of the most significant tactical innovations of the Pacific War, comparable to radar or code breaking in its impact. Professor Masanori of the Japanese Defense University wrote that the Strafer bomber destroyed not just ships, but Japan's entire concept of naval warfare, forcing Japan to abandon offensive operations earlier than would otherwise have been necessary. The inability to protect shipping from Strafer attack accelerated Japan's defeat by preventing the concentration of forces for counteroffensives. Stories of individual B-25 Strafer attacks became legendary within the units that flew them, passed down from veteran crews to replacements as examples of what the aircraft could accomplish. The attack on Simpson Harbor at Rabaul on November 2, 1943, saw B-25 Strafers sweep across the anchorage at mast height, their guns destroying or damaging dozens of vessels while skip bombs sank larger ships at their moorings. Japanese witnesses described the harbor being turned into a cauldron of burning oil and exploding ammunition in less than 10 minutes, with rescue efforts impossible because continued strafing punished anyone who ventured onto the docks. The modification process itself grew increasingly sophisticated as mechanics gained experience with the B-25 structure and capabilities. By late 1943, field modification centers could convert a standard B-25 to Strafer configuration in less than a week, installing the 8 nose guns, additional ammunition storage, and reinforced mounting points with practiced efficiency. Ammunition feed systems were refined to prevent jamming during violent maneuvers. Gun harmonization was perfected to concentrate fire at optimal range, and trigger mechanisms were modified to allow the pilot to fire selected guns or all 8 simultaneously. Skip bombing techniques also evolved as pilots gained experience attacking different types of vessels under varying conditions. Crews learned that approaching at a slight angle rather than directly beam on made it harder for anti-aircraft gunners to track them while still allowing accurate bomb delivery. They discovered that releasing bombs at about 60 feet altitude and roughly 340 yards from the target produced optimal skip patterns, with bombs bouncing once or twice before striking at the waterline. Delay fuses were adjusted by target type, shorter delays for thin-skinned transports, longer delays for armored warships. Japanese attempts to adapt to the Strafer threat included desperate measures such as mounting every available light anti-aircraft gun. But these additions proved inadequate against the volume of fire from 8 synchronized 50-caliber machine guns. Some captains tried radical evasive maneuvers, stopping dead in the water or reversing course suddenly, but B-25 speed and maneuverability allowed pilots to adjust aim quickly. The installation of radar-directed anti-aircraft guns on a few vessels provided marginal improvement. But by the time these systems were deployed, American air superiority was so complete that most attacks involved overwhelming numbers. Maintenance. Crews supporting B-25 Strafer operations deserve recognition for keeping heavily modified aircraft operational under primitive conditions. The nose guns required constant maintenance to prevent corrosion in the humid Pacific environment. Ammunition feeds had to be cleaned and adjusted after every mission, and the stress of low-level operations caused increased wear on engines and airframes. Crew chiefs worked through tropical nights to prepare aircraft for dawn missions, knowing that mechanical failure during a low-level attack almost certainly meant death for the aircrew. The intelligence network supporting Strafer operations proved equally important, with coast watchers, submarine patrols, and code-breaking providing information about Japanese ship movements. B-25 squadrons often received targeting information just hours before a mission, allowing them to catch Japanese vessels at their most vulnerable moments. The ability to strike targets of opportunity, made possible by the B-25's range and firepower, meant that no Japanese vessel could consider itself safe anywhere within 500 meters of an American airfield. The human cost of Strafer operations on American crews cannot be ignored. Low-level attacks against defended targets resulted in significant casualties. The 3rd Attack Group alone lost over 40 B-25s during the war, most shot down during strafing attacks when they were most vulnerable to ground fire. The psychological stress of flying directly at enemy guns, maintaining steady flight while under fire, and pulling up at the last second to avoid collision took its toll on pilots and crews. Many veteran pilots developed nervous conditions that forced them to be relieved from combat duty. Their limits were reached after too many missions watching tracer rounds reach for their aircraft. The B-25 Strafer's success influenced American tactical doctrine across the military, showing that innovative field modifications could sometimes outperform purpose-built weapons. The willingness of commanders like General Kenny to support unconventional solutions, even when they violated established doctrine, proved crucial to American success in the Pacific. The Strafer program demonstrated that giving creative individuals like Pappy Gunn the resources and freedom to experiment could produce revolutionary results that changed the nature of warfare. Japanese survivors of Strafer attacks often expressed a particular horror at the impersonal nature of the weapon, describing how the 8-gun nose turned killing into an industrial process. Unlike dive bombing or torpedo attacks where individual skill mattered greatly, the B-25 Strafer simply pointed its nose at a target and unleashed a stream of destruction that eliminated everything in its path. One Japanese officer compared it to being attacked by a flying machine gun nest, impossible to suppress, impossible to escape, arriving without warning and turning ships into charnel houses in seconds. The final evolution of B-25 Strafer tactics came in 1945 as crews prepared for the invasion of Japan, developing techniques for attacking suicide boats, coastal defenses, and industrial targets. The 8-gun nose proved equally effective against land targets, turning railroad locomotives into scrap metal, destroying radar installations, and suppressing anti-aircraft positions during larger raids. Plans existed for massive Strafer sweeps across Japanese harbors and anchorages intended to destroy the remnants of the Imperial Navy before invasion forces arrived. Japan's surrender made these operations unnecessary, but the Strafer's legacy lived on in modern military aviation, where the concept of heavily armed ground attack aircraft remains central to tactical doctrine. The A-10 Thunderbolt II, with its massive 30mm cannon, represents a direct descendant of the B-25 Strafer, designed to destroy ground targets with overwhelming firepower delivered at close range. The success of gunship aircraft in conflicts from Vietnam to Afghanistan can be traced directly back to the workshops in Australia where Pappy Gunn first installed 850 caliber machine guns in a bomber's nose. Veterans of B-25 Strafer units held reunions for decades after the war, sharing memories of missions that had seemed suicidal at the time, but proved devastatingly effective. They remembered the smell of cordite filling the cockpit as 8 guns fired simultaneously, the vibration that shook the entire aircraft, and the sight of Japanese ships coming apart under their fire. These men knew they had flown something unique in the history of aerial warfare, an improvised weapon that outperformed many purpose-built designs, a testament to American ingenuity and adaptability. Japanese military analysts and post-war studies identified the B-25 Strafer as one of 3 innovations that helped doom their empire, alongside radar and code breaking. The inability to protect shipping from Strafer attack meant Japan's island empire could not be sustained. Garrisons withered from lack of supplies while reinforcements never arrived. Admiral Soemu Toyota, the last commander-in-chief of the combined fleet, stated simply that the 8-gun B-25 destroyed Japan's ability to move by sea, a capability an island nation could not afford to lose. The technical specifications of the B-25 Strafer became the stuff of legend among aviation enthusiasts who marveled at the audacity of installing 50 caliber machine guns in an aircraft never designed for such armament. Each gun weighed about 64 pounds, fired 850 rounds per minute, and required elaborate ammunition feed systems to maintain continuous fire. The 8 guns together added more than 500 pounds to the nose, not counting ammunition, demanding careful weight distribution to preserve the aircraft's center of gravity. An ammunition load of roughly 400 rounds per gun meant about 3,200 rounds total, enough for approximately 30 seconds of continuous fire, though pilots rarely fired for more than 8 seconds at a time. The B-25 Strafer represented more than a successful weapon system. It embodied the American approach to warfare in World War II: technological innovation, tactical flexibility, and aggressive execution. Where other nations might have spent years developing a purpose-built gunship, Americans modified existing bombers in field workshops, tested them in combat, and refined them based on experience. The willingness to experiment, accept risk, and trust the judgment of combat personnel over distant planners proved crucial to victory in the Pacific. As the war ended, B-25 Strafer crews were among the most decorated in the Army Air Forces. Their missions had directly contributed to the isolation and defeat of Japanese forces across the Pacific. Presidential unit citations, distinguished flying crosses, and Silver Stars awarded to Strafer crews reflected the extreme danger and exceptional effectiveness of their operations. Though these decorations could not fully capture the impact of their service, the sight of 8 streams of tracer fire reaching out to destroy enemy ships, turning the tide of battle in 15 minutes over the Bismarck Sea. The last B-25 Strafer mission of World War II occurred on August 14, 1945, the day Japan announced its surrender. Aircraft of the 345th Bombardment Group attacked Japanese shipping in the inland sea even as the war ended, their 8-gun noses destroying several small vessels attempting to flee to Korea. The crews returned to find the war over. Their unique weapon was no longer needed, though the concept they proved would influence military aviation for generations. In final analysis, the B-25 Strafer stands as perhaps the most successful field modification in military aviation history, transforming a conventional medium bomber into a ship-killing monster that terrorized Japanese naval forces. From Pappy Gunn's first experiments at Eagle Farm to the mass-produced B-25J-22 with multiple forward-firing guns, the Strafer program demonstrates how innovation, born of necessity, can exceed anything planned by conventional wisdom. The 50 caliber guns protruding from the B-25s. Nose became a symbol of American determination and ingenuity, proving that in modern warfare, the side that adapts fastest often wins. The story of Japan's encounter with the B-25 Strafer is ultimately one of technological surprise and tactical revolution, where assumptions about aerial warfare were shattered in minutes over the Bismarck Sea. Proud in the traditions of a storied navy, the Imperial Japanese forces found themselves helpless against mechanics from Texas and pilots from Kansas who turned bombers into flying beasts. The 8-gun nose that Admiral Kimura saw approaching his convoy on March 3, 1943, represented not just a new weapon, but a new kind of warfare, one where innovation trumped tradition, and a few modified aircraft could destroy an empire's ability to sustain itself.